Vonen, who had a lecture yesterday at the Faculty of Humanities, School of Linguistics. He's going to talk about language politics in Norway.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thanks for the invitation to join this group of people coming from Norway to lecture here. And like the other speakers today, I do not represent the University of Oslo. I am working at a different institution in Oslo called Oslo and Akershus University College of Applied Sciences. Can you hear me properly? I think I can hear some strange S's. Okay. I have prepared these PowerPoint slides bilingually so that for your convenience, in case you might be interested in reading some Russian texts as well. I will, however, talk in English, since that's the language of the seminar. So my talk about language politics and language policy of Norway will consist of 3 parts. One part, in the first part, I will tell about the current official language policy in Norway, and then there will be 2 examples. One rather big example about the Norwegian orthography and the history of creating a new language that was already touched upon by a previous speaker. And the other one, a small example, I think, in terms of the time available, will be about minority languages in in Norway, and their political status, which is also in Norway considered an important part of language policy and language politics. So, language policy and language politics is carried out on many levels, and now I'm speaking in general about the concept of language policy and language politics at a state level, also actually at an international level, but at a state level, at the municipality level, the company you work for, or the family. So I will focus in this talk on the state level mostly. So, in Norway, I think, if I would sum up the state language policy of Norway as it is currently, it is a policy that tries to promote 2 things at once, 2 things that sort of pull in different directions at one. It tries to promote both linguistic community or commonality and linguistic diversity at the same time. This can be seen as an attempt to support our complex human identities. We have, as human beings, we tend to have different, not only one identity, but sets of identities at different social levels. And those identities include also language identities. So the main document of current Norwegian language policy is called the Language Report, a report from the Ministry of Culture 2008, which was discussed and basically endorsed by the Parliament in 2009. According to this report, the superordinate strategic aim of language policy in Norway is to counteract domain loss for the Norwegian language and secure a full status and use for the Norwegian language within all parts of Norwegian social life. So it has to do with the protection of Norwegian, and you may ask, protection against what? Well, the political process that led to this document took as its point of departure the fear that actually English might come and take over more and more domains of English language use in Norway. This was also touched upon previously by Professor Amundsen about the issue of language choice in higher education in Norway. So that's one example, higher education. However, even though that the protection of Norwegian language is the superordinate aim, it is very much emphasized in the document that the policy must be comprehensive and it must take into account the total language situation of the country. And the total language situation in the country also includes such things as the equality between bokmål and nynorsk, which I will return to in a moment, the old and the new multilingual diversity, the need of foreign language competence, and the Nordic language community, the promotion of continued linguistic commonality between Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland and Iceland in the use of Scandinavian languages that are mutually comprehensible. So, this report says that in formulating and implementing all official policies in Norway, one has to take into account certain considerations. The first one being that Norwegian shall be the main language and the common national language of the country, that Norwegian shall be a society supporting and a fully developed language, meaning including all the necessary terminology, for example. It says further that one always has to take into account that nynorsk must be equated more in reality with bokmål than is the case. So I will, as I said, I will return to this duality of nynorsk and bokmål in a moment. It also says that the civil service shall give priority to using correct and comprehensible language. And last but not least, it says that one always has to take into account that everyone shall have the right to language, to develop and acquire the Norwegian language, bokmål and nynorsk, to develop and use their own mother tongue or first language, including sign language, their own indigenous language or national minority language, and that everybody shall have the opportunity to learn foreign languages. Norwegian language policy has certain principles concerning the comprehensiveness, that it should be what we call cross-sectorial, that it involves activities of several ministries. It's not only the matter of the Ministry of Culture, although that is the official coordinator of language policy. It should be comprehensive, although it is anchored in cultural policy. Language policy and language planning is, as an academic subject, is often divided into three main parts, and you will find these three parts also in the language policy of Norway. Language promotion is one, language cultivation, and then the language users' right and education. So language promotion has to do with the promotion of use of certain languages. Language cultivation has to do with the development of means to strengthen the languages, such as producing dictionaries, for example, and so forth. So let's go into the first of the two examples that I promised you and talk about Norwegian orthography, or the way of writing Norwegian. If we talk about spoken Norwegian, we have to start with the fact that there exists no official spoken language standard. That is uncontroversial. You might say there exist unofficial spoken language standards, but none that is really anchored in the official language policy. So it is a society in which the use of local dialects and variants of spoken language are encouraged. For written language, there are two standard varieties. In Norwegian, the term used is målformer, or language forms. They are called bokmål and nynorsk, book language and New Norwegian. Within each of these two language forms, there is a choice between different correct orthographies even within each of them. Oops. So why do we have this rather unusual situation with two written varieties of our language? Well, I was happy to hear this morning that Professor Amundsen actually paved the way for this part of the presentation in a much more comprehensive way than I have prepared here. So, in the High Middle Ages, in the 13th century, Norway was a regional power. Old Norse, the language of the time, was blooming in speech and in writing. Then came the Black Death, then came Denmark, and Norway became a territory de facto governed by Denmark, and Danish gradually became the language of administration and the only written language. Actually a good example of the close relationship between political power and language power. So when Norway entered a new phase in the 19th century, and instead of the submission under Denmark had the more equal footing, but still being under the Swedish king, there was an urge to be able to say, this is a country, this is a nation, so this is our language. So it was rather quickly, or at least a few decades out into the century, it was a rather broad agreement that the nation needed a national language, but on what linguistic grounds should that language be developed? So, now the unusual part of the historical case of Norway comes into function, because actually there were two approaches that competed, and none of them actually totally won that competition. So there was one group with Knut Knutsen as one of the main figures that wanted to develop the existing Danish written language in a Norwegian direction. Remember that the linguistic distance between the Scandinavian languages is not that big. So there was a lot of work done in order to gradually change the written language used in Norway to more to represent more this, or to resemble more the Norwegian spoken language. Today's result of that process is what we call bokmål, or book language. The other approach, headed by Mr. Ivar Aasen, who you saw the picture of in Professor Amundsen's presentation, they chose a different approach. They said, let us give up the Danish written language. Let the Danes have it, and let us start from scratch in Norway and create a new written language on the basis of the dialects of our country. And particularly on those dialects that show the closest links back to the great days of the Old Norse language. So a scientific exploration of rural Norwegian dialects was carried out, and a new language was codified. Today's result of this groundbreaking and very impressive work in many ways is nynorsk. In 1885, the Parliament decided that the two language forms shall be equally valued. In practice, however, nynorsk has always been weaker than bokmål. And today, about 10% of users of Norwegian write their texts, or prefer to write their texts in nynorsk. 90% bokmål. In the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, the policy was one of rapprochement, or a policy of hope that the two language forms would melt together or blend together into one. And a rather active language policy was conducted in order for this to take place through official orthographic reforms. So on this little example at the bottom of this slide, you can see the Norwegian word for tired. I hope you are not so tired that you cannot read it, but it is in the orthography of 1959, where you can see that in both these varieties of Norwegian, the main spelling, that one supposed to be used by civil servants and by textbook authors of school books, is actually identical in the two language forms, trøtt. However, in both language forms there existed so-called side forms that were allowed to be used by pupils in the schools. And in bokmål, the side form was trett, more similar to the Danish word for tired, actually. And the nynorsk side form was trøtt with a diphthong. Yeah. However, this policy of rapprochement led to reactions, and unofficial variants, unofficial norms were created in protest against the rapprochement policy. So, and even today, some of these unofficial variants of both language forms exist, so that some people write what they call riksmål, a conservative bokmål, and some people write høgnorsk, a conservative nynorsk. Actually, these names of language variants are not very self-explanatory. Riksmål meaning nation language, and høgnorsk meaning high Norwegian. Just to add to the diversity, several of our newspapers have their own variants of Norwegian. So, it was towards the end of the 20th century, it was understood that the policy of rapprochement had not really worked the way it had been supposed to. At least not in the sense that that people accepted the idea of melting together the two language forms into one. Another thing is that in actual fact, the linguistic differences between bokmål and nynorsk today are much smaller than they used to be 100 years ago. So in actual language use, you might say that the rapprochement policy still did have some effects. But in 2002, Parliament decided that the previous aim of a future blending of the two language forms has now been cancelled. And we had new orthographic reforms in 2005 for bokmål and 2012 for nynorsk. And now one of the things that happened then was that the concept of side forms was removed. And the current orthography, or current correct writings of spellings of the word for tired now in nynorsk is only trøtt with the diphthong, and whereas in bokmål trøtt remains, and the earlier side form trett has been promoted to being an equal main form. So as I said, in practical writing, the two language forms have become much more similar to each other than they were 100 years ago, and the main differences are now in inflection, in other morphological processes, derivation, and to a certain extent in vocabulary, and in some cases like this in the presence or absence of diphthongs, for example. So, this diversity of written Norwegian, is it positive or is it negative? The answer to that question, if you ask me, is that it is primarily a fact and an important part of Norwegian linguistic culture. There is still the official policy of the state is still to promote the more real equality between the two language forms, including the so-called principle of nynorsk, which says that in linguistic matters, nynorsk shall always be taken into account. What are the consequences of this political measure for nynorsk? So, it seems that the written bilingualism represented by nynorsk and bokmål, seems to strengthen the population's language awareness. Any text written in Norwegian is the result of a linguistic choice, and a particular chosen form can be interpreted as an expression of the author's identity, political affiliation, or whatever. The diversity within each of the two language forms gives the author a choice to use the form that the author prefers. For example, a form that is closer to that person's spoken dialect. On the other hand, it can be more difficult for the author to know whether the preferred form is a part of the norm or not than would be the case if the norm had been more unitary. For pupils in schools, the norm diversity gives them the advantage in that they grow up in an environment where they can write relatively closely to their spoken language. And this may be considered a democratic advantage. Language policy is largely about choosing which linguistic rights a society wants to promote. And you might say that the situation with the two language forms persisting in Norwegian society is one way of expressing that our society wants to promote language diversity. Let's now proceed to the second example. And how many minutes do I have?
Wow.
Okay. To talk about language minorities, which is also, of course, a matter of linguistic diversity. When it comes to linguistic minorities, we will see that there are different languages with different statuses, political statuses, having to do with what kind of responsibilities Norway has agreed to take, among other things. So, there is one main national language, Norwegian. Well, I say it's one language. It is actually officially also said to be two, in that Norwegian, bokmål and nynorsk are sometimes talked about as separate languages, as long as we are restricting the discussion to the written domain. Then there are the languages of indigenous peoples, for which there are several international responsibilities that Norway has chosen to take. We have joined the European Charter of Regional Languages and the International Labour Organization Convention on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, with the basis in these international conventions, the Sami languages of Norway have a special status. The Norwegian authorities have taken responsibility to promote and develop these languages. In practice, the everyday language policy issues of Sami languages is carried out by the Sami Parliament, which is the parliament elected among and by Sami representatives of the Sami minorities themselves. I say languages because there are usually considered to be 3 Sami languages that are alive and spoken in Norway. They are all considered endangered languages. Then there are the national minority languages, and there are 3 languages that have this particular status as being national minority languages. They are protected by the European Language Charter, but not by the ILO Convention. And these languages are Kven, a language similar to Finnish, which is spoken in northern Norway primarily, And then there are the two languages of Roma origin, Romani or Romanes, as we say in Norway, which is an Indo-Iranian language spoken by a very small group of Roma people that have been in Norway for about 150 years. And then the so-called Scando-Romani language, or which we call in Norway Romanes, which is a language dating back a few hundred years, probably from an earlier wave of immigration of Roma people, but then changed into a language that has today largely Scandinavian kind of grammar, and but Romani vocabulary. So these languages, all these languages too, are protected through the European Language Charter. Norwegian Sign Language, the language of the deaf community in Norway, had until recently not been protected internationally in the same sense, because for some reason the European Language Charter has not yet been opened to include sign languages. But the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from 2006 was ratified by Norway in 2013, and according to that convention, we also have a responsibility to promote and develop that language. English has a very special position in Norway. It is taught to everybody at school from the first grade, and is used in many in many contexts in Norway, as we already mentioned. So it has actually in the school curriculum, it doesn't even have the status of a foreign language, because we have Norwegian as a subject, we have English as a subject, and then we have foreign language as a subject. And foreign language does not include English. It can be whatever other language that the local school administration is able to offer to their children. It can be the traditional ones like French, German, Spanish, but also some places languages like Russian, Japanese, Chinese, and also, for example, Norwegian Sign Language are offered as foreign languages. And also, all these languages also have the status of being recent minority languages of Norway, in the sense that they are used by immigrant communities. These languages, for these languages, Norway does not have any international obligations, but as I showed you earlier, the Norwegian language policy says that everyone has the right to use their own language. And as I'm sure you all know, the UN Declaration of Human Rights says that nobody shall be discriminated against on the basis of their language. So that was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes?
So thank you for your presentation. If talking about people who studied in Norwegian as a foreign language, which one of the written Norwegians do you prefer? Like, would you suggest that they are taught bokmål or nynorsk?
You mean, for example, here in Russia?
Yes, yes.
Well, I would hope that they would learn both, because Norwegian consists of both. In practice, almost everyone who learns Norwegian as a foreign language learns bokmål. and then only learned some nynorsk at a more advanced level. Until quite recently, that was also the case for immigrants coming to Norway and getting Norwegian language courses in Norway. These language courses had been developed only for bokmål. So even immigrants living in areas where nynorsk is predominant would have their language textbooks in bokmål. That has been changed or is changing right now because it's totally against our principles of language policy.
Any more questions? Yes?
Thank you for a lecture. That was very interesting. By the way, you were talking about higher education and the problem that English is more powerful in this case, yeah? So can you tell me something probably about its advantages? Because advantages are mobility. Of course, you can try to teach in research style and it's good for international students. But what kind of disadvantages do you have?
Yes. Yes, I think the main driving forces here is that the forces driving English to become stronger in higher education is partly mobility, as you say, both the fact that mobility exists, so that we have at every moment a certain number of foreign students at our institutions that cannot be expected to know Norwegian from day one. So some kind of accommodation must be made for them. And also for preparing for mobility, for example, outward mobility by Norwegian students, that they might have a better benefit of their stay abroad if they have been prepared by learning some more English before they leave. There's also, in the case of Norway, we're such a small country, we don't have good textbooks in every possible higher education discipline in Norwegian. So we, in practice, use a lot of English textbooks. And sometimes it can be easier to talk about your academic studies using terms from your English textbooks rather than making the effort to develop your own Norwegian terms. So those are some of the driving forces for English. Now, in order to sort of make a break on this and to promote Norwegian, there actually is a new article in the law on universities and university colleges. That article came around 2008, I think, which says that that all the universities and the university colleges of Norway have an obligation to develop and convey Norwegian terminology and academic language in those areas that they teach. So there is not only an encouragement for them to do it, but a demand by law that they do it. So then there is a balance. Every institution and every course has to make a balance between the demands for English and the demands for Norwegian. And actually there is a name for that kind of balance that is called parallel language policy. How to develop higher education in such a way that the home language and the international language may coexist in parallel.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Maybe one last question? Or yes?
I have a question. Would you please confirm that English is official language of in Norway in case of public sector documentation, that you can deliver all the documents in English and it will be accepted. And the second question is, what is your future scenario for bokmål in Norway in future? No, I mean nynorsk and bokmål situation. Yeah, thank you.
Well, concerning your first question, I am not willing to say that English is an official language of Norway, but for example, any company that is registered in Norway has to publish their annual reports in Norwegian. But I'm not quite sure about the regulations for individual people who want to use their English language documents for documentation purposes. I'm not able to answer that. Now, my guess about the future development of bokmål and nynorsk. Well, it seems that even though nynorsk is so much weaker than bokmål, it seems to be quite strong. There is the proportion of acclaimed fictional literature written in nynorsk is much larger than what you would expect from the low percentage of people using it as their preferred language. So it is a very strong language in some spheres, such as fictional literature, including many young writers. So I can not see any signs that it is actually dying. And the fact that the number of, for example, the number of pupils in schools that prefer nynorsk, it tends to go down a little bit every year, but that is probably more due to the general urbanization of Norway than to any real fall in the interest in nynorsk. It has to do with the tradition that nynorsk is more used in the rural areas and bokmål more used in the urban areas. But it's very hard to make predictions in this area.
Well, thank you. Just one comment. Just found online an article by an outstanding Russian Scandinavian scholar from St. Petersburg, Mikhail Steblen-Kamensky. An article from 1968. Is it possible to plan the linguistic development on that? And obviously here in Russia we read about it, we never had a hands-on experience on the linguistic policy. There was no linguistic policy. Russian was, let's put it like that, an organic language. We never tried to alter its development. But I think for many of you, that's not for linguists who are present here, but those from social sciences, it might be something new that in many countries, in many societies, there was and there is linguistic policy with a very conscientious aim to achieve certain goals. And the literal language and the oral spoken language are different things, something that we in Russia often do not really understand. Though, in fact, there is a very strict linguistic policy today in the neighboring countries, which were formerly our country. But anyway, we often miss it. Okay, so thank you very much. And now I'm passing the floor to our last but not the least, last presenter today, with a very important topic on religion and identity in Norway. I'm introducing Professor Aud Tønnesen, Professor of Church History and Dean of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oslo.
Thank you. I must say that you are impressive in your stamina at the seminar. It has been a long day. So thank you for the invitation to participate in this seminar. The topic of the lecture, Religion and Identity, is fairly wide and open and could be accessed in a number of ways. From a Norwegian perspective, the relation between church and state is fundamental to such a topic, and this will also be my approach. But before I start, I will just mention a few statistics about the religious situation in Norway today. From 2016, 82% of the Norwegian population belong to Christianity in broad. That is, they are registered as member of a Christian church. Out of these, 72.9% belong to the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Norway. 2.8% of the population are registered as Muslims, and 1.7% are registered as members of the Humanist Association, which is a secular life stance organization. The largest non-Lutheran religious community is the Roman Catholic Church with about 2.78%, whereas the Orthodox churches account for about 20,000 members, which is about 0.4%. So the majority church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, is by far the largest. And this was, until the 1st of January this year, a state church. Now it has the status as a so-called independent legal subject. I probably also should add that this church is liberal compared to most other churches and faith communities globally. About 30% of the ministers in the church are women, and of 12 bishops, 4 of them are women, and the leading bishop is also a woman. And this year, the church meeting, which is the highest decision-making body, decided to introduce a new liturgy, opening up for same-sex marriages in the church. It also allowed ministers that were against it not to participate in same-sex marriages if they find it wrong. So you see, the relation between church and state has been very strong, and then in particular between the state and the Evangelical Lutheran Church. So therefore, in order to understand anything about the politics of religion or the religion and identity complex, we have to involve a study of the state church and the state-church relation. This has been the Today, this is a model based on the principle of freedom of religion. At the same time, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, despite the changed relations from this year on between church and state, is still written into the constitution and supported by the state. But we also have the situation that the state also financially support all other registered religious communities according to the number of members. So we have a church that is constitutional, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, supported by the state, but we also have a politics saying that all other registered religious communities should receive financial support by the state according to the numbers. The state is secular, but leads an active, supportive politics of religion in that way. So one of the questions today is how this support and how this politics should be further developed. Can and should, for example, the state, when it has this supportive politics, be able also to make certain demands on faith communities with regard to norms and values? And that is a question I will return to at the end. But in order to understand the recent developments within the field of religion and politics, we have to understand the historical background for them. And therefore I will take you through very quickly some aspects from the history of the state-church relations in Norway from 1814, which was when we got the constitution, and until today. So therefore I added as a subtitle to this lecture, from a Lutheran civil servant state to a secular and religion-tolerant state. And I've divided this into 4 phases. The first phase, from 1814 and up, I would say, until 1880, I name then the Lutheran civil servant state. Whereas the second period goes from around 1880 to the mid-war period and could be named then the liberal Protestant state. And then from around 1935 to 1990, the state is defined by an understanding that religion is private and not a public concern, and I have therefore called it the private religion state. And then from the 1990s and onward, we have experienced what many sociologists would call the deprivatization of religion, that public and political debates in new ways are impacted by a situation of religious plurality and global perspectives. This is also the case in Norway, and at the same time, the state, through these phases, has developed into a secular state, but still not religiously neutral. So I've called this last period the secular and religion-tolerant state. So I'll start with the first. The Lutheran Reformation in Norway in 1537 dramatically changed the organizational relations between church and state. We have already heard a little bit about that in some of the earlier presentations today. The properties of the Roman Catholic Church were taken over by the king. The church was nationalized and the state became Lutheran confessional. The Catholic Church ceased to exist in the Danish-Norwegian monarchy that was established in 1537 and lasted until 1814. And in this long period, only Catholic individuals were tolerated, but not the Catholic Church as an institution. And from 1660 to 1814, the state was a Lutheran confessional absolute monarchy. And the absolute Lutheran Danish-Norwegian monarchy ended in 1814, but the Norwegian state, in fact, continued as a confessional one. The Norwegian Constitution of 1814 was in many ways among the most liberal ones in Europe at its time, building on the principles of the sovereignty of the people, of power distribution, and individual rights. But when it came to religion, the Constitution was a blueprint of the politics and laws of the former Danish-Norwegian autocracy. And paragraph 2 read, the evangelical Lutheran religion remains the public religion of the state. Those inhabitants who confess thereto are bound to raise their children to the same. Jesuits and monastic orders are not permitted. Jews are still prohibited from entry to the realm. So the new Norwegian state at that time had and knew only one religion and confession. The principle of freedom of religion was omitted in the latest phases of editing the Constitution. And historians have debated the reasons for this. Was it due to hasty work at the end, a case of distraction at the very end, more or less unplanned? If that had been the case, there would have been opportunities to include the passus in later editions of the Constitution the same year. More likely, therefore, this late change was willed and had a reason. Probably, this was due to the understanding of the foundational role of religion, that religion was the foundation to state and unity. Shared religion meant shared values and shared ethics, and without such a fundament, the new state would soon be in danger of dissolution. The Constitution of 1814 further confirmed that the king belonged to the state's religion, and as head of the church, as was the Lutheran principle for organizing the church after the break with the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, the king was responsible for church order and liturgical affairs. He appointed the clergy and the bishops. According to the Constitution, the Norwegian people were a Lutheran people, and thus, accordingly, civil and legal rights were given on the basis of religious belonging. The civil servants were Lutherans. The school was a church school leading up to confirmation. Religion was no private matter, but in every aspect public. And areas such as school and poor relief were under the inspection of the clergy. Religious competence in the population and their reliability had to be tested. In a confessional state, people should know their confession. Religious censorship existed. It was not allowed to gather in private homes for religious meetings without clerical sanctions. Changes came gradually and slowly. In 1842, the ban against private prayers, meetings, and religious assemblies was lifted. And as Professor Muruvik also said, this ban also prevented social movements from establishing themselves. So with this ban lifted, we also see a whole new energy within the establishment of social movements. More important maybe to the development of the state from being a confessional state to a more liberal one is the introduction of law on Christian dissenters in 1845 that gave permission to establish non-Lutheran churches in the country, as well as opening up citizenship to non-Lutheran Christians. Although restricted, it was a first step towards a more liberal politics on religion. Then further, in 1851, the ban against Jews was lifted, whereas the law forbidding Jesuits into the country was changed only in 1956. Despite these new laws, there were clear restrictions as to the rights of dissenters. They could still not take up positions as state civil servants, and although a new school law passed in 1860 marked the beginning of the development of a new common school, Lutheran Christianity was still a major subject, and schools were still under the inspection and control of the church. So was the case with the new laws on poor relief passed in 1845 and later in 1863. Despite political discussions concerning the reasons for poverty, the emphasis was still on individual moral defections as a main explanation, and therefore it was only natural and right that the clergy would continue to supervise the local poor relief committees. Secularity as differentiation had not come far when we reached the latest third of the 19th century. And this picture that you can see is from one of the private meetings. It's a famous painting. It's not a very good picture, but you can see this is a private home, and they have gathered for a religious meeting. And this is Hans the Haugianerne, which is one of the strongest and most influential movements that we heard about. Hans Nielsen Hauge, who also traveled around the country, not only gathering people for private meetings, but also building up industry. And here is one, and the light is on the preacher there. And this movement also actually allowed women to preach. So outside of the state control, also a more liberal praxis was a more liberal praxis when it also came to women's authority as religious persons. If we then move to the second period, which I've called the liberal Protestant state, and the shifts are naturally gliding and could be debated, but still there is some meaning in this way of identifying certain developments. So the law on Christian dissenters in 1845 marked a beginning towards a more liberal politics on religion. In the years to follow, several laws were passed that would loosen the strict confessional bindings made by the state on its citizens. The Lutheran Civil Servant state moved in direction of a liberal Protestant state, the Lutheran confession still being the normative fundament for state and society, but no longer the only one tolerated, and the bonds between church and state would also loosen up. According to paragraph 92 in the Constitution from 1814, all state civil servants had to belong to the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the state church. Further into the 19th century, this was problematized both by liberal politicians as well as leading clergymen who were critical of the state church and the religious bindings of society. And in 1878, the law was changed, restricting the confessional bindings only to members of the government and to judges. An additional law was passed in 1880, stating that professors in theology at the University of Oslo and also other civil servants teaching religion, which at that time only meant Christianity, were bound to be members of the state church. And in fact, this binding lasted until 2012 for the university professors. Which meant that when we hired professors with a different or another belonging, we had to ask the church department or the ministry responsible for church affairs to permit us to hire that person. Other reforms came later in this period. The ban against monastic orders was lifted in 1897, but as I said, the ban against Jesuits was only lifted in 1956. Confirmation was mandatory for all church members until 1911 and regulated by common law. Baptism was mandatory until 1902, partly also because of pragmatism, since the clergy registered all the births, so baptism was a way of keeping records, track records with newborn children. The integration of church and state was, as we see, fundamental to the order of the state, although changes in the state's regulations gradually widened the national citizenship and the civil rights to include non-members of the state church. This is also notable in the areas of school and poor relief, which I think are very excellent examples to illustrate some of these changes. With the school law of 1889, confirmation was no longer the final exam. And in the area of health services and poor relief, new actors were welcomed on the stage. The Roman Catholic Church opened hospitals in several cities, and so did the Methodist Church, and the Salvation Army started social work in Norway in 1888. They were given a space in society hitherto restricted to the evangelical Lutheran Church. So in the liberal Protestant state, Church of Norway was prioritized and privileged, but no longer the only church on the public arena offering services to a broader part of the population. The state tolerated other churches and confessions and gave them space where they could unfold activities, reaching out beyond strict liturgical and spiritual borders. Activities that necessarily placed them into the larger society and in contact with people in general and not only the members of their own congregations. At the same time, liberal tendencies impacted clergy and lay people, though with minor success, I would say, when it comes to their work for liberation of the church from the state. A relatively strong movement in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century worked for a liberation of the church from the state, but failed in its efforts. So the church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, continued as a state church under the control of the state. But, as we have seen, the state at the same time developing a more liberal and religiously tolerant politics. So we could say that in this period, the church is not liberated from the state, but the state is increasingly liberated from the church. Then we move to the third phase, what I've called the private religion state. The political developments in this period are very much connected to the influence of the Social Democratic Labour Party. In 1935, the Labour Party came into government. In 1945, after the German occupation had ended, the Labour Party won the election and would govern alone until 1965, with a supreme majority in the parliament until 1961. The period has been called the one-party system, as well as the social democratic order, both referring to this party's dominance and overall influence on politics in the post-war period and further up, going up to the mid-1970s. This is, as we have been hearing about the welfare state, this is a crucial time for the development of the Norwegian welfare state. It is also a crucial moment when it comes to the developing of a new politics of religion. And here we meet a clear ambiguity in the Labour Party's politics. On the one hand, the party had a history of quite large tensions, but also to a certain extent hostility towards church and religion. The main emphasis was placed on religion as a private matter when it came into government. So, consequently, for example, the clergy should no longer have a seat ex officio in local school boards or in child welfare committees, as had been the rule so far. So the church presence in school, in welfare system should be reduced. On the other hand, the state church system prevailed during this period, more or less unchanged from 1814, where we had the law taken over. So we're actually, when we come to 1945, we have the same law going actually back to the 1660s and even further. So we continue with the church law, which is very much the law from the absolute state. In 1945, the Labour Party initiated a process to change the state church order and extend the freedom of the church from the state. The process dragged out and resulted in nothing at the end. In 1953, the Parliament voted down a proposal that would have established a church council, which would have given the church a relatively independency. Why did they do that? Two factors seems to have been decisive. One, there was, and that was clearly expressed in the Parliament debate, an explicit fear that the church would be a conservative obstacle to the Labour Party's vision for a new welfare politics. Because in the years before, some of the church leaders had uttered very critical comments on the welfare state developments, warning against it, that it could develop into a secular absolutist state. So that was one main argument in the parliamentary debate. Then secondly, around 95% of the total population of Norway still belonged to the state church, therefore catering to the religious needs of the people within a state church system could also be seen as a welfare state responsibility. All political parties have, to various degrees, throughout the history of the state church, sought to influence theology and ecclesiology of the church. And the Labour Party represented no exception to this. The government, when it had decided upon furthering the state church system, would, for example, appoint clergy and bishops and use its power deliberately to organize a theological balance between conservative and liberals, but also to push the church in a liberal direction, giving strongly support to the liberal forces within clergy and theology. And I will give you one example. I think it is fair to say that without the state church system, it would have taken a much longer time to realize women's ordination and access to the ministry of the church, and the promotion of gender equality within the church without a system like the state church. The ordination of women was highly controversial. In 1938, the law regulating the entrance to church ministry had been changed, allowing women to be ordained and employed as clergy. But there was one exception, and the congregation was given the right to resist women. So if the congregation would not hire a woman, they were not forced to. In 1956, this exemption was uplifted. And in 1961, the government, which was the Labour Party government, appointed the first woman as a minister in the state church. And you see a picture of her there. She was not young, as you can see. She was about 60 years when she was ordained. And she had started her education at the university when she was 50. So she was a grandmother and had also been part of the resistance during the war. So she had kind of a strong stamina to stay up against strong power that wanted to repress her. So she was the first one, and became a minister in the north of Norway on an island where nobody else wanted to go. And her husband came with her, just to continue with her, and he said, and he went into retirement a little bit early to go with her, and he said, if she can become a minister, then I can become a minister's wife. So he would bake and cook and take care in the way that ministers' wives had traditionally done that. But this was, of course, highly controversial, the appointment of her to take position as a minister in Church of Norway. A majority of the bishops were strongly against it, and so were the majority of the professors in theology. They argued that on the basis of the Bible, the Holy Scripture, the tradition, women should not be ordained. Such an ordination meant a violation of the church, a violation of the basic Christian teaching. She was appointed, and the interesting thing is that the debate about women ministry very soon turned into a heated debates about the state church system. So the state church system was addressed critically because that was the one that had made this possible, and new demands for the church's liberation from the state came up. So we see there is a clear ambiguity in the politics in the years after World War II. On the one hand, religion was a private matter and therefore should have no public role in state institutions or in welfare politics. On the other hand, the state church continued as a public institution under the state. And in particularly, the Labour Party used its power to actively influence its ecclesiological and theological developments, often, as in this case, in straight opposition to the majority of the church leaders. All along, the state politics on religion continued to develop in a liberal direction. Freedom of religion was finally positively included in the Constitution in 1964. Then, in 1969, a new law was passed guaranteeing religious communities outside of the state church financial support from the treasury. And the law read like this: registered religious communities are entitled to an annual grant from the treasury. The grant shall be proportionately, approximately equivalent to the sum budgeted for the Church of Norway, and shall be calculated on the basis of the number of members of the community. So, the church tax should then be divided to the different religious communities according to the number of members. This was a compromise, and you could also say a hybrid model for politics of religion in Norway. It was a compromise, allowing the state to continue with the state church system that was clearly a system that discriminating the principle of equal treatment of the various religious communities. But at the same time, the new law would then give other church and faith communities the same right to be supported by the state as the state church had. So I've called this a hybrid model, and I think that if we can talk about a Norwegian model on the politics of religion, it is related to this law, where you try to balance between keeping up a state church system on the one hand and the liberal politics of religion on the other. I would also like to mention a High Court verdict in 1984 that also drew up a final and principal line regarding the issue of the influence that the Church and the evangelical Lutheran teaching should or should not have on the state. The High Court verdict said only in matters of strict concerns to the Church order, the state was bound by the evangelical Lutheran religion. In all other areas, the state was religiously and morally free, and religion was a matter of private preferences. So, moving up to the last period from the 1990s until today, and to what I've called the secular and religion-tolerant state. And this is just to give you one image. You see all the various different religious leaders here. They have taken a course, how to be a religious leader in Norway when you have a background from another country. And then, so this is the one you could say is kind of part of the more liberal developments. And at the same time, you have an ordination of one of the bishops, where you have at the very end the king present, which is then a very public event. So this is one image of the Norway that we have had, and like Professor Amundsen, he raised the question about the multicultural situation, and this is an image of that, and that is one of the challenges that I will say something about. I think there are two developments within this period worth noting. Firstly, in 1997, a new subject was introduced in school called Knowledge of Christianity, Religion, and Philosophies of Life. Facing the challenges of an increasingly religiously and culturally pluralist society, this subject was constructed to further social cohesion. The younger generations should be educated to tolerate differences and also respect the foundational history and culture of Protestant Norway. Suddenly, there was a shift in politics from religion being only a matter of privacy to see Protestant religion as part of an active politics of identity construction for a pluralist society. To revitalize Protestant Christianity as a societal integrative fundament in this way was, of course, highly controversial and stirred debates, and was also strongly contested in a society marked by secularity and religious pluralism. What could have been taken for granted maybe 50 years earlier or 100 years earlier could no longer, of course, be taken for granted. So in 2007, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg gave a verdict stating that the new subject was in conflict with the parents' freedom of ensuring their children an education in conformity with their own religious and philosophical convictions. So the subject had to be changed, and the role and dimension of knowledge in Christianity had to be reduced. And this led to a reform of the subject, and the new subject was now called Knowledge in Religion, Philosophies of Life and Ethics, without any references to Christianity. But of course, a subject like this is also open for negotiations within politics. So a change again in 2015, after heated political negotiations, introduced Christianity again as a major part of this subject. At least 50% of the teaching should be about the Christian religion. So this is today the case. So this is one development as to how the state is trying to find a way with religion in the pluralist society. Secondly, the state system has been under deconstruction during this period. And in 2012, the constitution was changed, and paragraph 2 would no longer read the evangelical Lutheran religion remains the public religion of the state, but instead the basis of our values remains our Christian and humanist inheritance. This constitution is to ensure democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. So you could say that with this paragraph, the secularization process of the state have been going on from since the mid-19th century was completed. But at the same time, the constitution, which no longer said that the state has a religion, said there is still a national church. The evangelical Lutheran Church was no longer to be a state church, but was still constitutionally based. It was still part of the responsibility of the state and declared as national church. So according to paragraph 16, it now says all inhabitants of the realm have the right to free exercise of their religion. That is basic, the freedom of religion. But then the next sentence, as you can see, says the Norwegian church, an evangelical Lutheran church, remains Norway's church and supported as such by the state. So the church no longer has a religion, but it has a national church that is Lutheran and is in continuity with the former state church. How to understand this? It must be said that the constitutional change that took place in 2012 regarding religion was a reform of the state and not of the church as such. Detached from the bindings that the former paragraph 2 had on the states when it came to one religion, the state now was realized as secular, but also as a religion-tolerant state. One of the bindings that had been very influential on the politics was that according to the constitution, because of the state church system, and because the church was under the governance of the government, the majority of the members of the government had to be members of the state church, so that they could make decisions for this church. So that meant that when forming a government before 2012, you had to ask everybody who were a member of Church of Norway. And then sometimes you have to have some hasty, they have to go into the church very hastily so that they could become part of the government, or you have to make changes in other ways to arrange that. This is no longer a case. You don't have to take into consideration church membership of actual candidates. Freedom of religion is basic to all, also including the state, but still not to the king, who is still, by the constitution, bound to be a member of the evangelical church, which is something he wanted. At the same time, through these changes, the history of integration of state and church over centuries is still acknowledged as so important to the majority of the Norwegian people that it is written into the constitution. So the Evangelical Lutheran Church is Norway's church and has a national responsibility. It is also supposed to cover with its services the whole country. This is a demand on this church that is not placed on any other church or religion. And the reasons and motivations behind this is that it is said to represent belonging in an identity in a way that transcends and is not relevant to other religions. So identity and belonging could and should probably also in this case be understood not only as individual identity and belonging but also collectively. It has to do with the historical roots of the nation, and the church is said to represent some of this identity through its history. First, I will show you a photo, which could be images of the new normative conflicts that we can see now. So I'll just point to some dilemmas that are on the agenda in Norway today. What does freedom of religion mean in Norway in 2017? And can the hybrid model, where you both have a privileged church and, on the other hand, an active financial support for any other registered religious community, continue and survive? And can it also be further developed in a fruitful way? As we know, on a global scheme, religion has again become a key factor for identity politics, political mobilization, and conflict on the one hand, whereas at the same time, major religious communities insist that true religion has nothing to do with conflicts, is something else, is peaceful confession to human rights and common values in the general community. So religion is on the agenda, has also become contested notion in the period of massive migration and also increased violence and political confrontations. So therefore, when we have a quest for a new politics of religion today, it takes place not only on the background of national politics and national developments, but also global developments. So how does this affect the Norwegian model for politics of religion? As introduced in the beginning, 72.9% of the population belong to the Evangelical Church of Norway. Less than 3% are registered as Muslims, whereas Christians outside of the Church of Norway account for about 10%, the Roman Catholics being the largest group. And the existing politics builds on the generous interpretation of freedom. In order to secure the freedom of all religions, the state should not only tolerate them, but also support them actively and financially. This means that it is not only a passive toleration and a recognition of religion, that is actual politics, but a supportive toleration. So, in reality, it means that Salafist Muslims and Lutherans can both practice their religion with support from the Norwegian state. This is the main way that the Norwegian state act as a secular state. It doesn't have clear normative criteria regarding the contents of the faiths that are entitled to receive support, other than, of course, that if you violate the laws. But when it comes to norms, it is not very clear. But increasingly, a question has been raised: should the state act more progressive to combat what could be seen as norms and values and practices that seems to contradict what is the Norwegian norms of today? Should the state intervene to secure that rights and norms basic to Norwegian society, is not only respected by the faith communities, but also integrated into the organization. As we have seen through this very short history of the state church system, there has been a tradition for the state that it has, during the years of the state church system, sometimes used its power in ways that has impacted and changed theology and church practice, as was the case with women's ordination. This has been a politics enabled and legitimized by the state church system. But how should the state in the future relate to religious communities that are not state religious communities, but still supported by the state? Communities that represent and even promote values and norms contradicting, even undermining the state's politics. Can and should it intervene for change? Many of the questions coming up like this as to the role of the state towards religious communities are related to the Muslim community, faith communities. The last weeks, newspapers and politicians in Norway have focused on the lack of gender equality in Muslim societies and mosques, in the boards and leadership. Should the state withdraw its financial support from religious communities because of failure to accept and include gender equality, or lack of respect for gay and lesbians and their rights? One other question has been raised: is the recent politics of religion, with this lack of normative criteria for the support towards financial support of religious communities, is the recent politics of religion in reality a support to conservative Muslims rather than progressive Muslims that would ask for and would welcome a more active state intervention to combat, for example, controversial issues regarding gender? Has the politics of differentiation between the state church and other faith communities in reality deprived other religious societies from developing a more progressive religious identity? Then you could ask, should a national state impose its national values on faith communities that by and large are also international communities? Is there a need to develop a Norwegian Islam, for example? But clearly, it is not only Muslim communities that have difficulties in meeting the Norwegian politics on gender equality. Other cases that could illustrate the same problem would be within the Roman Catholic Church or within Orthodox churches. Then, and some of the other debates that we have now around the state and religion is, of course, related to the gay and lesbian rights, but also we have had a very critical discussion on the right to circumcision. Is circumcision a medical or a question of medical treatment or a religious imperative? And then the other concern is, what about the still privileged position of the Church of Norway, written as it is into the Constitution? The number of members is decreasing. Can it, and how long can it be recognized as a national church? And if not, how will the Norwegian model of religion politics be affected by when you no longer have a large majority church, but only minority religious communities? Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have some very limited time for questions, if there are questions. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Could you please describe the role and status of neo-paganism in Norwegian society and its role for creating the national identity?
Thank you. There might be others who would answer this better, but it has been a part of what you could call a national politics, where you see that people go back to the old Norse myths in order to develop a new national identity. And you see it in particularly on the right-wing side of nationalism. And of course, when we had in the terror attacks at 22nd of July, if you read the manuscript by Anders Behring Breivik, you see that he has very many references to Old Norse myths and paganism. Then, of course, that is one thing. Then you have, of course, what you could call a more post-structural paganism related to women's movement for the empowering of women, which is very much inspired by American influence, which is not that strong, but you have certain strongholds in Norway as well.
Okay, maybe one last question, if there is a question. Okay, if there are no questions, so we are passing to the conclusions, and I'm inviting our Vice Rector Ivan Valdevich Prostakov, and we have Radina Trengi right here.
So, okay, maybe you can share your impressions.
Yes, thank you very much. Dear Prorector, dear moderator, guest professors and students, dear audience. It is really nice to see that you have chosen to prioritize this seminar. I think that this has been a very great day for, hopefully, for all of us. Today's event would have been possible without such a great host as High School of Economics have been, without engaged academical collegium from both University in Oslo and High School of Economics and the Norwegian University Center in St. Petersburg, and of course without so many curious and motivated students as you and the previous students who participated earlier today was. Today, our Norwegian professors try to give you a knowledge piece, I will say, about what characterizes the Nordic model, how the Nordic model has developed over the years, and discuss some important peculiarities of the Norwegian society. I hope that this day has been inspiring and interesting for you. I also hope that today's lectures have given you a starting point for some reflections and further contributed to expand your horizon. Yesterday, our guests had some good and useful discussions with several of their colleagues from the Faculty of Humanities and Faculty of Social Sciences at High School of Economics. Hopefully, these days not only strengthen the existing cooperation between these two universities, but may open the way of new cooperation opportunities. Neither can we ignore the fact that such an open seminar on various relevant topics can be repeated and even became a tradition. Let's hope that this maybe be dream who can come true. This exciting tour is far from being over. Our Norwegian professors are traveling in the afternoon to St. Petersburg, and tomorrow we will have another exciting and interesting day together with your colleagues at your campus in St. Petersburg. And for me personally, I'm really looking forward to be a part of the continuation, and will do my best to facilitate such meetings venue for knowledge sharing also in the future. Thank you for a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Stangerit. In fact, as you said, today probably is a starting point for reflections, but probably it's also a starting point for new projects between HEC and Oslo University and maybe other universities in Norway. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend all the conference or the seminar. Even I'm very curious to know more about Norway and your society and also other aspects of the organization of Norwegian economy and political system. So I really hope that we'll have other occasions here in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Obviously, tomorrow it will continue, but here in Russia, but also probably in Norway, to continue our exchanges. This kind of meetings, this kind of open lectures that I suppose are very useful and very important for our relations. So once again, I really hope that we are only at the beginning of the new stage in our relations, and we will continue in the same sense, with the same spirit of cooperation and dialogue. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you for all professors from Oslo University. Thank you to the embassy for its support, and we hope to see you again. Thank you and goodbye. And just for to continue and to give you the willingness to continue and to share in your mind and your spirit souvenir of HEC, little gifts from our part. Thank you.
T-shirts for the speakers.